Wisdom. It's something we'd all like more of, and that's our topic today, wisdom at work. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We're here for another great episode. Our guest today is Chip Conley. Let me tell you about Chip, and then we'll get started. Chip is a rebel entrepreneur. That's enough. We can just go on from there. Chip is a rebel entrepreneur and a New York Times bestselling author multiple times. He formed a company at age 26 that transformed one inner city motel into the second largest boutique hotel brand in America. After doing that for 24 years, he sold it. And soon the young founders of Airbnb asked him to help them transform their company into the world's largest hospitality brand. We'll talk about that today. He's served for 4 years as their head of global hospitality and strategy, and today is the company's strategic advisor for hospitality and leadership. I'm guessing that's a title that was made for you.
Yes, it was. Thank you, Kevin.
Sound like that already existed. Anyway, he's written a brand new book. We're going to talk about it today. It's called Wisdom at Work: The Making of the Modern Elder. He holds a BA and MBA from Stanford and an honorary doctorate in psychology from Saybrook University. He's coming to us today from the San Francisco Bay Area. And Chip, I'm glad to have you with me today.
Kevin, thank you. It's an honor.
So listen, I'm excited. I told Chip before we started that our goal on this show is to have leadership experts and expert leaders, and he was in both camps, and he said he was half of each, but I actually think he's probably more than half of each. But let's talk about your journey. The bio says a little bit, my intro says a little bit about that, but sort of how did you get to where you are today? Give people a little bit of that picture.
So, well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be with you and your listeners. As you said, I graduated from Stanford Business School, and I was actually quite young. I was 23 when I graduated long ago, and I was working for a real estate developer in San Francisco, not all that engaged. I think you could have one of three relationships with your work. It's either a job, a career, or a calling. I thought I had taken a job to have a calling. It turned out into a job. So there's two choices at that point. Either you just stay with it and get bored and you find your calling outside your work, or you go searching for your calling in a new way. And I did. I said, I know real estate, commercial real estate, but I find hotels interesting. And at that point in the mid-1980s, boutique hotels were just getting off the ground in the United States. So I decided to create a boutique hotel company, call it a really impractical name, Joie de Vivre, which means joy of life in French. But I do love the fact that our mission statement was the same as our company name. And then I created this, bought a motel in a bad neighborhood in San Francisco. It became a sort of successful rock and roll hotel called the Phoenix. And then 24 years later, after creating 52 boutique hotels, I sold the company to John Pritzker, whose father started Hyatt.
So then you found yourself, I'm doing the math, at about 50.
Yep.
And you found your calling, you lived your calling, and then you left. So then what? Obviously we know you got to the Airbnb thing, but what led you to sell then? And then what sort of was going on for you at age 50 when you're sort of hanging out?
It's interesting. When you have a calling, you're willing to throw all of your full life into it. Now, I had a good life beyond my work, which was nice. I was workaholic a little bit, but I was also living my calling. And, the difference between living your calling and workaholism is a compulsion, and living your calling is a devotion. And so sometimes it was compulsion, workaholism. Sometimes it was devotion.
Life is balanced, Chip. Right?
Yeah. I had both. But what I think I found was I had started to grow bored, and I'd gone from one person, me, to 3,500 people in the company. And the creativity and sort of inspiration of what it was when I started it felt like it had gotten lost. And so in the Great Recession, I said, you know what, I'm tired of this. Plus I had a flatline experience where I died on stage. I gave a speech and I was on an antibiotic that I was allergic to and I had a broken ankle and my heart stopped. So that was at age 47. So within 2 years after that, I'd sold the company. And then I'm in this place of like, well, what's next? And I sold it at the bottom of the market. So it wasn't the best. I mean, I did well and I didn't have to work the rest of my life, but I hadn't made a fortune. I wasn't doing it for the fortune, that's for sure. I was doing it because I really loved what we'd created. And I was asking myself, what's the next thing? What's the next calling? And there's a movie called The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway. And Robert De Niro becomes a 70-year-old intern to a young CEO. And he says something in that movie that's interesting. He says, a musician doesn't retire. They quit when there's no more music left inside of them. And what I knew is I still had music inside of me, but I wasn't sure who to share it with. And it was about at that time, I got a call. Actually, at this point, I'm 52 years old, and I'm 58 soon. At 52, I got a call from Brian Chesky, who was the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb. And just to at that point, I'm a longtime hotelier, and Airbnb was this disruptor getting into the hotel business, or into the lodging business. Quite frankly, 5.5 years ago when he reached out to me, I didn't know that much about them. I was based in San Francisco. They were based in San Francisco, but their core audience was budget-minded millennials staying in urban markets. It was a pretty small company and was really perceived as being just a tech company. So he reached out and he says, I would like to have you be my mentor, and I'd love to have you be the head of global hospitality and strategy. I was like, well, that sounds interesting. Let's do it for 15 hours a week. I got started, and of course, within about 3 weeks, this was 15 hours a day. And I said to him, you caught me. And he said, yeah, we need you. We need you more than you thought you needed to be needed. And it turns out I did need to be needed there, because I was surrounded by people who were half my age. And long story short, that's really what led me to writing this book, realizing, wow, I was 52 years old. I was twice the age of the average employee. In the past, 20 years ago, that means you might have been the wise elder, or the person who had all of this accumulated knowledge, and you were just going to dispense it to people. But this was a totally different environment, Kevin. This was a tech company. They were speaking lingo I did not understand, technology lingo.
And you thought you knew the lodging business, right?
I thought I knew the lodging business, but I didn't know the tech business. And this was really a tech company creating a global marketplace of home sharing. And long story short is, between not understanding a lot of the cultural references they had, nor the tech lingo, I realized, and it was scary, that I am an intern as much as I am a mentor. And that's what led me to thinking, my gosh, the modern elder, as opposed to the traditional elder, the modern elder is as much a student as they are a sage. That they're as much of a learner as they are a teacher. And so what I came to realize was my role there was not just to be Brian, the CEO's mentor, but it was to be his intern and a bunch of people's intern. And the implicit trade agreement that really got created there was, I was offering EQ, emotional intelligence, in a variety of ways: leadership, development, how we, thought of helping people do their best work there, even strategic thinking. So I was offering EQ. They were offering DQ, not Dairy Queen, but digital intelligence.
But there was no Dairy Queen available, Chip?
No, there's no Dairy Queen in San Francisco, unfortunately. But so what we did is, it was like a generational potluck. I brought EQ to the table. They brought DQ, digital intelligence, to the table. And we had an amazing feast. And so one of my premises of the book is, wow, we have 5 generations in the workplace for the first time. Power is cascading to the young faster than ever before, because things are changing so quickly because of technology. And so the accumulated knowledge of the elder of the past is of some importance, but not a whole lot of importance because things are changing so fast.
Would it be fair to say it's I mean, you wrote the book, but I'm just listening here and I'm thinking about my preparation for our conversation. Would it be fair to say that it's of different importance?
It's of different importance. There's certain things that are timeless and will always be important. Understanding humans. I think the most neglected fact in business is that we're all human. And so the operating system, to use a little tech lingo, the operating system for working with humans is to understand psychology and your own self-awareness and awareness of others, and having that, what we call emotional intelligence. That will be timeless. I actually think, frankly, in the future, it'll even be more and more value as the world becomes more robotic and artificial intelligence. And there's, I think, a really keen value to the person who has intuitive emotional intelligence. So I think that's timeless. On the other hand, what's not timeless is how the hotel operated 20 years ago and applying that to a marketplace of hosts. And my job was partly to be in charge of all of our Airbnb hosts globally. And we now have 5 million homes on the platform. So that's a lot of people. And for me to just talk about how things work in the hotel business isn't all that relevant to that micro entrepreneur who has a cottage in her backyard and rents it out to people from all over the world who come and stay at her home. Some of it's, the hospitality principles of, just being friendly is fine. But how many?
But that's back to EQ again, as it turns out.
That's right. But how many rooms a maid cleans in an 8-hour shift doesn't matter to an Airbnb host who has one cottage and she's the one cleaning it. So I think the key is, in looking at being a modern elder, is you start by actually stripping away and editing what from the past is not necessarily going to serve you here. You become, and I call that the evolution phase. And then the next thing you need to do is be like the most curious learner in the room. And you need to intern publicly and mentor privately, which basically means be open to actually asking very curious questions to people in meetings, because frankly, you're surrounded by a lot of people who think they're sort of know-it-alls. This Airbnb was full of Google and Facebook and Apple former employees, the smartest people in the world, and they all wanted you to know that. And so if you were the person in the room, not trying to have all the answers, but you had the catalytic questions, you were a differentiator. And what happened over time is, because I focused on evolving out of my historical identity and becoming very catalytically curious with a beginner's mind, people could then tap into my third and fourth lessons in the book, which are how you use your collaboration skills, which as you get older, you get better at collaborating, lots of evidence of that. And then how do you use your counseling skills, your advisory skills? Because what happens is the more you get to a place where people see this person has some wisdom, people flock to you. And you end up, over my course of my 5.5 years now at Airbnb, I've mentored more than 100 people there, even though that wasn't my job. It was just something I was doing on the side because people were asking.
So it seems to me that one of the great blessings that I have of being able to have these conversations and have others later to listen to them is that there's always something, Chip, that someone says. I mean, I write, you can see I'm writing notes, but there's always something that my guest says that like gives me something to think about for a long time. And you just said it. Catalytic curiosity. I think that I do both of those things, but I've never necessarily thought about them together, said the way you said it. So I'm going to personally thank you. And for all of you listening, you should probably write that down in case you missed it while you were jogging and you missed Chip saying that, the idea of catalytic curiosity, which I also don't normally, when I'm interviewing or having this conversation with my guest, I have a copy of the book, even if the book's not out yet, which it isn't, as we're talking, but I don't have today. I'm guessing that phrase is in the book. Am I fair?
It is. It's there a few times because once someone said that to me, I couldn't stop thinking about it, because
See, just like me, right? Just like me.
A well-crafted question, a really well-crafted question can open up a lot of possibilities. And so one of the thoughts I'd offer your listeners is that I think the more senior you get in business, the more you get focused on the what and how of business. And what and how are fine questions, but they are optimization questions, which means that you're on a certain path. And the question is, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And it's sort of very it's not necessarily asking a big catalytic question. The catalytic questions of the world are the why and what if questions. And then if you think about who asks why and what if questions, it's usually 4-year-olds. Why is the sky blue, mommy?
What if we did this?
Yeah, exactly. So my questions were more why and what if questions than how, what, and how. And I didn't necessarily notice it until somebody told me. And the reason I asked these kind of questions is because if you go into the room with the sense that you can be the beginner's mind in the room, it allows you to be intern publicly, meaning you can be a little bit naive. Now, if I was just an idiot and I was asking stupid questions and I had nothing to offer anybody else, I would be careful about taking the advice I'm giving you here. But if you in fact are open to showing your vulnerability of like, hey, I'm not sure I'm catching you. Now, if you're going to ask a question, it's just sort of like like a dictionary informational question. I don't understand that lingo. Have a list of questions you want to ask someone one-on-one afterwards. You don't want to slow down a meeting.
Right.
But if you ask a question, as I did at Airbnb, so why don't we help our hosts understand that the quality of the experience the guest has is based upon the following set of things. We've heard from our guests, these are the most important things, but we haven't done a very good job about actually communicating that to our hosts. What if we actually created a super host program that helps someone to actually strive to have an extrinsic motivator, a badge that says you're a super host based upon the things that most are important to guests? I mean, it's so obvious, and yet I was asking it partly because I was thinking, why isn't this here? But instead of saying, why isn't this here? I was more like, I asked it in a humble way. And I think that's a real key with people who are getting older. One of the things about getting older is you have to especially if you're surrounded by young people. And let me start by saying more than 40 or almost 40% of people today in America have a boss who is younger than them. Now that number was about 20% 10 years ago. So that number will be over 50% in the next 10 years. So let's recognize that there's a lot of us, we're going to live longer. Many of us are going to work longer, and we're going to be working with people younger than us. So the first thing to know is to be an elder in the past meant reverence. And today it means relevance. We've moved from reverence to relevance. And what does that mean? It means just because you're older doesn't mean people are going to revere you.
And I think that's an important point. I mean, many of us, I certainly was taught, and respect your elders and all of those things. And I don't think we shouldn't do that. But I think the point that you're making is that as I'm going to say we, because I'm just a couple years behind you, as we get older, we can't expect that.
That's right.
Nor should we expect it, because that's just showing our age of, well, when I was young, I was taught that.
Yeah.
We're waiting to be respected.
Exactly. And I as you can tell, I like alliteration and words. So, catalytic curiosity, 2 C words, reverence and relevance, 2 R words. But what does it mean to be relevant? It means that you're humble enough to learn, and you've got an insatiable appetite for growing your mind. There's a book by Carol Dweck, Stanford professor, called Mindset. And the book is all about how do you identify whether you have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And in different parts of your life, you could have one or the other. But I introduced that book to Brian and the senior leadership team to help them see that, frankly, for us to be a small little company that wants to grow up to being ultimately the largest hospitality brand in the world, which we now are, amazingly, we have more places to stay than anybody, including Marriott, the largest hotel company in the world. So in order to do that, you've got to have a growth mindset. You can't just focus on trying to prove yourself. You have to improve yourself. And that's the big difference, so for those who don't know it. When you have a fixed mindset, you tend to create a sandbox that you can play in that you're going to win. Meaning you only do things that you can do well because you use your successes as a way to prove yourself. And you know what? Let's say I do that in parts of my life for sure. We all do it at certain times. When we're scared, we certainly do that.
Yep.
A growth mindset means you play in a larger sandbox because you're not trying to prove yourself. You're trying to improve yourself. And when you're in the business of improving yourself all the time and you're getting better, not only are you personally becoming better as a leader, but as a company, you become a more successful company. And that really defined us. And I think for me, as an older person in the workplace, having a growth mindset such that I was not scared to be the dumbest person in the room. And it didn't take my confidence away by asking some naive questions. Uh, and when I say intern publicly, mentor privately, when I was in a meeting and someone 20 years younger than me was running the meeting, and it was very clear that person had never been instructed on how to run a meeting. So instead of actually in the meeting constantly telling them to do something different so they felt like I was their father, instead, the mentoring privately meant at the end of the meeting, especially if it was somebody I felt like would be open to this, they had a growth mindset and they wanted to get better. I might actually pull them inside and said, how do you think the meeting went? And, and they would say, well, this or that. And you know what, one of the things I kept hearing was, those people in the meeting are so dumb. And they didn't mean me, but they're not getting what I'm trying to say. And I said, have you ever had an opportunity to understand how to create an effective meeting and how to design an alliance so you actually can create a common ground where people who have a different point of view can actually come to a good compromise solution with you? And invariably they would say, no, never. And I said, well, I bet you have some things that you could teach me, and maybe there's some things I can teach you. Let's go have lunch sometime and let's just share our wisdom with each other. And that's what became my life there at Airbnb. I was sharing my wisdom. They were sharing their wisdom, and wisdom was flowing in both directions, which is not historically how wisdom operated. Wisdom was sort of downhill. And now it's like the waterfall's flowing uphill too, because I learned, I have an Instagram account. It's not all that good yet, but I didn't know how to, I wasn't going to figure out Instagram by myself, but I had a 24-year-old teach me how to, create my Instagram account. And
there you go.
Yeah.
So you can find Chip on Instagram, apparently.
Yes.
So
yeah.
We've been talking about the book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of the Modern Elder. And we've really been talking about what it means to be a modern elder, which is awesome. But you mentioned to me something called the Modern Elder Academy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I went from full-time at Airbnb to just a strategic advisor role as a consultant, it gave me the time to write this book, Wisdom at Work. And as I was writing the book and interviewing a lot of people, one of the things I was hearing over and over from people in midlife was what a marathon it is. I mean, I think midlife used to be 45 to 65. Today, it's almost like 35 to 75 because people feel irrelevant earlier and they're going to work longer and live longer. So I heard a lot of anxiety and bewilderment. And it's almost like people did not know at age 50 or 55 where to turn to help them through the transition that they were going through. Transition could be going into a new career, going in, starting a new job. It could be having a divorce, and it could be losing, a spouse, et cetera, et cetera. We sort of have in society, we've historically had rites of passage, celebrations and rituals during times when people are in transition. Puberty, bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, quinceañeras. You're going to graduate from being a child to being an adult. You have a commencement ceremony in high school or in college. You're going to get married. You have a wedding. You have babies. You have baby showers. You die. You have a funeral. But in between the baby showers and death is this really long marathon.
And we're not having birthday parties anymore after about 16.
No, exactly. So what I really realized is what if we were to, I'm a hotelier, so I'm in the business of hospitality. What if we created a hospitality experience that allowed people to come for a week or 2 weeks? Our programs are either 1 week or 2 weeks with a bunch of other folks who are similarly in middle age and there'd be 12 to 18 people in a group. And it's on a beachfront campus in Baja, California, which is an hour north of Cabo San Lucas in Mexico. And what if people could come here and then go through a curriculum that's based upon my book, Wisdom at Work, that helped them to imagine how to repurpose themselves for the second half of their life. And so we did it for the first 6 months of this year, had 153 people go through the program, got spectacular feedback, and we opened to the public this November. And so people can apply. and it's a nonprofit, and so 50% of the people are on scholarship, and it's my way to give back to my cohorts at my age who are looking to repurpose themselves. So we've had social workers walking down the beach with investment bankers and sharing their wisdom with each other. So it's not just rich people, it's people of all socioeconomic levels. And people can find it at my website, Chip Conley, Conley spelled C-O-N-L-E-Y, chipconley.com. You'll see the book there, and you'll also see the Modern Elder Academy site.
There you go, the Modern Elder Academy. So thanks for that, Chip. So, I there's lots of stuff I'd love to talk to you about. I've got a couple things more that I wanted to dive into, just maybe not dive because I don't really have time for diving, but I'd like your thoughts. So one is, we've been talking about the generations at work really for this entire conversation, and we've not used the B words or the M word or any, right? Millennial, I guess maybe you said it one time.
Millennial and
context
boomer.
of the conversation, right? So I guess my question to you would be this. What are your thoughts? I mean, and you said the same thing that I always say, we got 5 generations in the workplace at once for the first time ever. What are your thoughts about all the generations mixing and merging? Any other thoughts beyond the stuff we've talked about?
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons that you hear sometimes boomers or even Gen Xers and others beating up on millennials is because, well, first of all, there's always been a sense of the older generation looking at the younger people and saying, oh, those younger people, and fill in the blank. I mean, when boomers were the youngsters, of course, it was about they're so self-absorbed and they're taking drugs and they're hippies and they're not as committed to having a 30-year career with one company, et cetera, et cetera. So younger people are always going to be sort of well, first of all, they're always going to be a little more narcissistic and self-focused. That's just sort of how they are until they actually maybe have babies, and then they can't be quite as self-focused. But I think that there's that ground. But I think the big resentment that comes is the fact that when you and I were growing up, Kevin, the dominant technology that we as young people knew really well was television. And television did nothing to help my career necessarily, unless I was going to be an advertising executive or a TV producer. But the young people today, the dominant technology that they got to learn was technology and the internet and all of the apps that exist. And that dominant knowledge, that what's called digital natives, as opposed to you and I are digital immigrants.
Yep.
Digital natives grew up with this stuff, and it is a huge career benefit to them. And therefore, I think the resentment that we hear is twofold. One is the world is changing faster than ever before, and technology is more in the core of it. And so that makes people who are a bit tech phobic scared and upset because the world's moving more quickly than it used to.
Yeah.
And then secondly, and sort of the corollary to that is, and it's cascading power to millennials faster than ever in the history of the organizational world. And so I think the key thing to know here is that generational potluck idea is that I think the best companies of the future are going to be really smart about how they harvest the wisdom from the various generations and create teams. There's a ton of evidence that teams that are diverse do better. And that could be gender diversity, it could be race, but it also is age. And a lot of times we don't think about age as a diversity metric. And I think that what my book is hoping to do is to help companies and CEOs and HR leaders look at it and say, you know what, age is a diversity element too. Why don't we actually consider that?
The age diversity of my team is about to change as my daughter, our intern for the summer, goes back to school. But at this moment, Chip, 19 to 72. That's ours.
Wow, I love it. I love it.
We'll lose the bottom end of that here shortly, but we still. I'm really pleased that we got 72 on the top end, and everyone who's listening who doesn't know, it's not me. It's 72. Let's be really clear. So the next little section of our conversation is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Leader. You can learn more about how to lead remote teams by going to longdistanceleaderbook.com. So what I've got for you now, Chip, is what I call the fast break. And I've got 3 ideas from the world of business. And I'm just going to share them with you. I just want you to share what your thoughts are about them. We don't need to go a long time, but it doesn't have to be a single word either. So everybody, he does not know what these are. So you're working without a net, Chip. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. The first one is entrepreneurship.
Well, there's two kinds of entrepreneurs. There's the for-profit entrepreneur, and then there's the social entrepreneur. And I have spent most of my lifetime being a for-profit entrepreneur. And with this modern Elder Academy, my goal is to address a social problem, not a consumer problem. And so I think they're both important. I think entrepreneurship itself is how we are able to change the water in our aquarium. And if you don't change the water in the aquarium, it gets sort of murky in there. So I think pioneers and entrepreneurs are what helps the economy stay fresh.
All right. Second idea is change management.
I'm not a huge fan of this phrase, because I think it's very much from the 90s or the 80s, when change wasn't happening quite as quickly. I mean, change management is just like daily breathing. We in the operating business world today. So I actually think change management's fine, and I think it's important, but I actually think it's almost like I don't know. It feels like such an obvious part of what business is today, that it feels a little bit stuck in a time when change was more novel.
There you go. And one more. You may have a similar thought about this one. I don't know. The last one is performance management.
Performance management I feel better about, but I think the question is, because performance is important in business and in organizations, no doubt about it. And so I think the question is, how do you do your performance management? Traditional performance management was like once a year you get your the dreaded review, and that process is usually not very good, and the information is not always that helpful. And I just think performance management is a great idea that needs to consistently be improved. And I think what works in one company doesn't necessarily work in another. So I think making sure that there's clarity about what are the performance metrics and what are the variety of things that can be done. I like the idea of giving some kind of performance review of people on a monthly or quarterly basis. I think doing it once a year is nuts.
I'm with you. It's interesting. We've had a couple of recent guests. So those of you listening, will have had the chance to go back and find them, where we've talked about the idea of the problem with best practices, right? And I think that you just described it very specifically, and I think very appropriately as it relates to performance management. This idea, we got to find what works in our organization. It doesn't mean go try to transport it in from someplace else, because it may not exactly work. I think we're in agreement on that. So before we finish, Chip, I just have 3 more questions, and they get easier now. The first one is, all the stuff you're doing, all the stuff you've done, what do you do for fun?
Oh, wow. I love traveling. I'm fascinated by other cultures. So I love traveling around the world and experiencing cultures I haven't seen or met before. I'm a pretty avid athlete, and I've just learned a year ago at age 56 how to surf. So I live in Mexico, in Baja, where the academy is half the time. And I'm learning how to surf. Learning how to surf in your mid-50s is not easy. And even learning...
Listen, I don't think it's probably easy ever, but I'm sure in the mid-50s it's harder.
No, it is harder. And I'm also learning Spanish for the first time, so that's not easy either. There are a variety of things that I actually wrote I write a lot of articles on LinkedIn, and I wrote an article about what advice I'd give a 10-year-old, a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 50-year-old. And I think a 10-year-old, I would just recommend, learn some languages, because it's so much easier then. And I'd certainly tell a 20-year-old that's a good time to surf. So I love doing a lot of different things. So that's my answer.
Awesome. And I know that you are a reader, because we talked about it before I hit the record button. It sounds like our libraries are about the same size. Yeah. So what are you reading now, or what's something you've read that you feel like today you want to share with folks?
Sure. I'll give you 2 books. One I just read called The Happiness Curve by Jonathan Rauch. And that book is really speaking to something that's gotten a lot of press, but there's never been a book written exclusively about the subject. What has been found in social science is that People tend to be happy in their 20s, and then in the late 20s, it starts to diminish a little bit, goes down in their 30s. The 40s are where it gets really bad. And then actually in the late 40s and early 50s, it starts getting better. And actually what's fascinating is people in their 60s are happier than people in their 50s. People in their 50s are happier than people in their 40s. And people in their 70s are happier than in their 60s. So the book is about how, frankly, from age 50 on, it gets better, and why that's the case. And it's, for those people who are struggling through their 40s or their midlife, it's a great book to read.
Hey, you just told me the midlife goes to 75, and I
I know.
felt better immediately. I'd never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So
the other book I would just say is Man's Search for Meaning. I'm a big fan about that book. Viktor Frankl's book about what it's like to be in a concentration camp. I actually find that to be a leadership book, mainly because it helps you to realize that the best thing you can do as a leader is to help create the conditions for people to have a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose in what they're doing.
It's interesting, Chip, that while we're recording this, it won't be released. When people hear this, this will be some history back here. You go back on my blog, because this morning I wrote an article about the idea of we should be reading not just the latest bestsellers like The Happiness Curve. We should be reading the classics, and that could be the classics, or that could be, to me, Man's Search for Meaning is the classics. Wouldn't put it in that same, high school literature classics category. We ought to be reading those kinds of things, and we ought to be going back to them if we've read them before. And if you haven't, so I'm just going to add to, we ought to read both of these books. And if you haven't read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, like, it needs to be on your list near the top.
Yep.
I would agree with you 100%. So the last question for you, Chip, the one you wanted me to ask from the beginning, which is, where can we learn more about you and your work? You mentioned LinkedIn, you mentioned chipconley.com, but where else do you want people to, where do you want to send people?
Sure. I mean, you're welcome to follow me on Twitter, or there's a Facebook page group for the Modern Elder Academy. You could look for us there, or there's a Chip Conley author page as well. But I think the best place is just to go to the chipconley.com website.
Perfect. And so for all of you listening, my question for you is, now what? You've had about 35 minutes of time with Chip, one of the longest conversations we've had, because I didn't want to stop, Chip. But listen, for all of you, now what? What are you going to do with this? I mean, hopefully you enjoyed it, our chat, but mostly what action are you going to take? And depending on where you are in your own life, what lessons do you take from this that you can go apply for yourself or in your business? If you don't take some action, if you don't get a little past listening toward being more curious, thinking about being more catalytically curious, for example, one of the things that's on my list from this call, then this was of less value than it could have been. So I hope that you'll do that. Chip, thanks so much for joining us. It was a true pleasure to have you. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right. And so everybody, if you like this, you might want to come back. We're here every week. We got a whole bunch of old ones. We just talked about the classics, but we're here every week with a new expert, and you can join us here. I hope you'll do that right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.